Hello, my name is Lisa Baudouin, and I'd like to welcome you to the Dynamics of Abuse presentational series, Part 1, Who is Lisa Baudouin? This video session is part 1 of a 6-part series on a presentation that I created solely on my experiences and theories of how I believe abuse starts and continues, as well as how I think we can stop and even prevent it. Each video session will lead into the next, which not only helps me present the theories that I have, it will also help me to stay on task. In this session, session 1, we're going to be exploring a little bit about myself and my history and how I came up with this theory of the dynamics of abuse. As we advance through each slide, you'll see the menu topics located on the far left side of the slide. As this presentation includes a great deal of additional information, at times you'll see a source internet link for them on the bottom of the slide of where I've gotten that information. These sources will also be included at the end of each video session. Before we continue, I must also warn you that this presentation contains topics such as abuse and violent and sexual behaviors. Therefore, viewer discretion is advised. That being said, please know that everything that's presented in these video sessions are based on my experiences and interpretations only. I'm not the doctor or therapist. I'm the patient. So I'm simply here to convey my experiences that I've gone through, along with some educational tools and theories that I use, some of which I've come up with myself. And finally, I also recommend that prior to this video, you have a binder with some loose leaf paper or a spiral notebook, or at least a couple sheets of paper for notes. So now let's begin this presentation by talking about me in this first video session, as I'm just trying to give you an idea of who I am and why I am the way I am, along with how I came up with these ideas and the theory I have on the dynamics of abuse. As we get into the other sessions, I will share a bit more here and there for 2 reasons. First off, my path was and still is one of discovery, which this is what I want to share with you. But also, too, I want to use some of these examples of my own experiences to show you how well my theories actually work. So, who is Lisa Baudouin? Well, I am Lisa Baudouin, or sometimes people will call me Lisa Bowden. How do you do? My maiden name was Lisa Solberg. I was also previously married, so some people know me as Lisa Swanson. I was born on April 9th, 1962 in Racine, Wisconsin in the United States of America. Here's a picture of me when I was about 55 years old, and I know in this picture it may seem like I'm a really well put together person, but the fact is I suffer from multiple mental conditions due to things that happened to me when I was younger. These are my parents, Amy and Wayne Solberg, and sadly, as I grew up, both of them would eventually come to abuse me in different ways. The abuse for me started with my mother, Amy. At the time, I had 2 older sisters, but my mother's anger seemed to be targeted at me, and as I grew older, the neglect turned into a resentment towards me that would eventually turn into severe punishments. Then, when I was about 4 years old, my whole family moved in with my grandmother, my father's mom, who we called Granny, which I believe was due to the rising suspicion that my mother couldn't take care of us. Most would think that things would get better, but it didn't, at least not for me. My grandmother would be gone twice a week housekeeping, and my father at work driving truck and sometimes gone for days. During those times, you could find my mother with a bottle in her hand, and I became so intuitive to her changing moods due to the liquor. She'd go from being a pretty quiet person to a woman bent on pure anger and all usually directed at me. The saddest part was that I was just a little girl and I couldn't understand why my mother hated me so. Why did she do all those horrible things to me? Awful things that you'd never ever think someone could do to their own child. Well, that's what we're going to talk about in session 3 when we get into the actual dynamics of abuse. And then there's my father, Wayne. All I remember about him when I was young was that he was a very quiet person and most of the time gone. He'd had some problems holding down jobs, and I remember he did everything from photography to truck driving. But after we moved into my grandmother's house, things started happening that I didn't quite understand, and the fights between him and my mother also escalated through time as my mom began drinking alcohol more and more. It was a world where there'd be moments of absolute chaos and pain to moments of peace and quiet, and then back to the chaos again with my mother. Then, Some more unusual things happened in the early 70s. It was around the time that I was 11 years old, and what ended up happening was that my dad held us, meaning the whole entire family, captive in our home for almost a year. How and why it happened is in one of my stories that's called Layers. But what's important for you to know right now is that once caught, my dad was put in jail, and my mother gave my sisters and I over to the state of Wisconsin, which we were all then placed into separate foster homes. I remember I was very scared and I just wanted to go home, back to the only place I knew, even if that meant being abused by my mother, because although I had a pretty nice social worker and was treated fairly by the foster parents, that wasn't the case with some of my foster sisters or my schoolmates. What had happened to my family was all over the news, and I was ridiculed because of it, confused and sad, and most of the kids would call me names such as Hermit because that was a headline in one of the newspapers. But some were just mean and wanted me to go away, like one of my foster sisters, who would kick me and dare me to kick her back because then I'd get into trouble. She continually urged me to run away, and so one day I finally did, back to my grandmother's house, but I got caught and I went to juvenile detention that night. They put me back in the foster home the next day, but then I would eventually run away from there again and every foster home I was in after that. Finally, the state of Wisconsin deemed me a juvenile delinquent and I ended up in the Martin Luther Group Home in Stoughton, Wisconsin. I remember being very terrified there that first night I was there. I did grow to like the counselors, and for the most part, I made a couple really good friendships, some that have lasted even up until today. But the fact was, there was no one to care about me, and so I ran away from there too. Now, my dad had served some time in prison for keeping us children out of school, but by the time I was in the group home, he'd already been out of prison for a while. And even though I didn't realize it then, he was very different of that sort of shy person I remember when I was a child. He was drinking and having these huge parties at my grandmother's house, mostly young adults, but there were some teenagers there. Usually they were a bit older than me and mostly were friends of my older sister. But this time, when I ran away from the group home to my grandmother's house, I found out that my dad had gone to stay in St. Louis. The publicity from what he'd done had made him very well known in Racine, and he felt he just couldn't find a job. So what he had done was bought a camper truck to commute back and forth to stay in St. Louis for extended periods of time. And he was working with another man who had a store selling plaster casted objects. He was also donating plasma. I believe that he felt that combining these things together seemed to be the only way to him that he could make money. And so I hitchhiked to St. Louis and I found him there. And again, although he seemed very different to me, at the time I didn't think much of it when he offered me a pill to take along with the glass of brandy that he put in my hand. I trusted him, so I took the pill and drank down the brandy. But sadly, the next few weeks would become a complete blur as my dad would repeatedly incest me, taking me to his friend's place where they would take sexually explicit photos of me and with my dad in many of those photos. From that point on, my dad kept me prisoner in this state of fog, but eventually I finally started coming out of it. I remember walking with him down a street on a hot summer day and mentioning to him that I felt very sick to my stomach. My dad said it was probably because I was pregnant. I just glanced at him and said, "That's impossible." I remember I started to shake, and I remember this hot sizzle of fear running through my head and then down my body. I shook my head in denial and said, "No way," but my dad insisted that it was true. And that's when my dad pulled out a Polaroid picture from his pocket and showed it to me. There was no denying it was me with him in that photo, but it was a me I didn't recognize at all. I felt completely numb and tears started running down my face as my dad took the photo from me and put it back in his pocket, quietly insisting to me that it was perfectly natural that we'd been together like that. Years later, I found out that the pill my dad had given me worked much like ecstasy does today, but I didn't know that back then. And so throughout the next several weeks, my dad was trying to convince me that what was happening was perfectly okay, even that I was the one who had wanted it, just like in the Bible where Lot's daughters had seduced him. All I can remember is being completely confused and feeling such shame that I could barely talk. But as I was coming out of the fog, probably because my dad didn't want the drugs to hurt a baby if I was pregnant, which thankfully I was not, one night as he was passed out, I slipped away from him. I ended up staying in St. Louis and turned to the only other person I knew there. The problem was that she'd been staying with a man who I didn't like at all, who I knew was giving her drugs, but what I didn't know, the drug was known as Preludin. It's a type of speed, and when injected, it's as addictive as heroin, but how it works on the user is much like the pill ecstasy. It causes the user to have an increased libido. So what this man was doing was shooting up my friend and other women living with him with this drug, and then soliciting them out to other men for money. Again, I knew none of that. All I knew was how much pain I was in. So this time, while I was there, I asked the man if I could try it, which I did, and I instantly became hooked on it. And so now to pay for my habit, the man would prostitute me out to other men, men who'd keep me for several days in a hotel, but also inject me with other drugs, such as more speed, methamphetamines, opiates, or heroin. One day, it finally became too much for my body to take when, already injected with Preludin, a man injected me with more Preludin and then with Digoxin, and I ended up hallucinating. I remember telling him how old I was, and he took off and left me there. After hallucinating for what I think is about a day, I went into the bathroom, threw up, and then looked at myself in the mirror. There before me was not the pretty girl I thought I once was, like the photos that I'm showing you on this slide. The first photo is me in 1973, in fourth grade, just prior to the incident at the house. And the other photo is me taken at Stoughton High School, just prior to the summer when all of this happened. But now I didn't look like that anymore. I was down to a size 0. I had pyorrhea of the gums, so you could actually see the nerve endings in my gum line. This was because I wasn't eating, and then my hair that was once long and very beautiful and shiny was now dull and falling out. Still, something inside me told me I had to stop or I would die, so I made the decision right there and then to run away back home. There were more events that took place, but basically, the point is, I ended up back at the group home. This time, though, my behavior had really changed. I'd become argumentative and at times even violent. I was breaking things there, and they had no choice but to give me back to the state. From there, I ended up in another foster home in Racine, Wisconsin, but I still suffered greatly from the effects of the abuse and the drugs. I had a hard time getting along with anyone, and even though my gums were getting better, my hair was still falling out, now in clumps. I would put it in ponytails or put a hat on so nobody would notice. And through the years after that, I became even more engulfed in my own pain and rage. I ignored my own behavior while I blamed everything else happening to me on everyone else, especially my mother. And eventually, I lived my whole life in what I call an adult in denial. Fast forwarding to my 40s, I looked back on a trail of many successes only to be squashed by my own self-sabotaging behavior. And in 2011, it had become so unbearable that I became suicidal. So I desperately called the suicide hotline. I was introduced to a therapist who had a PhD in behavioral therapy, who not only saved my life, but showed me that I was suffering from mental conditions due to what had happened to me as a child. Those conditions are known as complex PTSD, which is a severe case of post-traumatic stress disorder, borderline personality disorder, which is also known as BPD, which is a person who has rigid and unhealthy patterns of thinking, functioning, and behaving, and dysthymia, which is a mild but persistent depression. It was very unfair to realize that because of what my parents did to me when I was younger, I now was the one to suffer and pay a whole lifetime for it. But in time, I also realized it was a good thing to find out about these conditions because, as scary as they sound, it answered a lot of the questions I had about my own behavior. And also, too, I now had therapies for those conditions that I could do to make myself a better person. I now had a type of direction to take that was going to help me make sense of why I was like I was. And on this new path of changing direction, I began to try many different therapies. I kept a journal that helped me vent and open up repressed memories. But in the longer term of things, it helped me to see the patterns of my life. I'd already quit smoking cigarettes, but now I began to read up on how to get more healthy, and I began eating better and exercising more often. This led me to the next part of my healing, which was understanding why my parents did what they did to me. And as I researched them, I realized that they both had suffered from things when they were little, which means they most likely had been suffering from hidden trauma and more than likely mental conditions as well, all their lives due to their own childhood. I was on a path of discovery, not only using the therapies that my counselor gave me and some that I researched, but also some that I was making up as I went along. And it was right about this time that I also wrote a short story based on my past called Layers. Back then, I'd also created a website to put the story on, which unfortunately I no longer have. But up until then, too, all I could do was ask, why did this happen to me? The thing is, with the website, people started contacting me through the website and some that I just had contact with in other ways. As I told these people my story, I found out that these people also had similar experiences, and I couldn't believe how many survivors there were out there just like me. The miraculous thing was how much others would open up to me. One lady who was in her mid-60s told me that she'd been incested by her grandfather from the time she could remember until she turned into a teen. She'd held that secret all her life until, for some reason, after I shared my story with her, she felt comfortable enough to open up to me. It was like a door had been opened up between us, which was an amazing comfort to us both. But on this journey, I also met people who hadn't been abused at all by their parents. They were just interested in my story, usually because they knew someone who'd been abused and wanted to understand and help that person. But sometimes they were just interested and wanted to understand abuse a little bit better for themselves. So then another set of questions began to grow in my mind. Why hadn't those people been abused by their parents and I had? What was so different about their parents versus mine? And so a theory grew in my thoughts. I wrote it down and I put it on a web page calling it The Dynamics of Abuse. I then made another web page called Changing Direction and what therapies I was using, including the ones I made up for myself. And then I would print out those pages, and I've been meeting with survivors free of charge ever since. Usually these are survivors of incest, but lately I've been asked questions about other types of abuse and even addictions. And my theory on the dynamics of abuse seems to work so well that it works in all abusive models with all violator types. And so I decided to present these same theories and therapies in this 6-part presentation. There was a time I couldn't even talk about what I've told you, and still, it's not as easy as it may seem. I'm not good at being photographed or videotaped. My anxiety levels rise sometimes to the point where I have to take breaks as my nervous system shuts down. But I feel so strongly about this theory that I want to share it with everyone, and so this is a very good way for me to do it. I'm actually taping this in pieces, and I stop when I need to. As far as my story and talking about abuse, yes, of course, it still hurts. But I translate that pain in a different way, and I can guarantee you that understanding how abuse works helped me to overcome the trauma of my past and deal with my life's ups and downs in a more healthy way. And it's my biggest wish to share this information with others. This concludes session 1 of 6 on the dynamics of abuse. Please find the link below to watch session 2 to continue with the presentation. Thank you.
I think the most important message I have for everybody here is just being able to get up and speak. Because I'm able to get up and speak and post it out there, other people who have been in my shoes, who are following me, will be able to get up and speak. The one thing I've noticed when I talked to Tony about was when I talk to people about this, they will confide in me, and it's just like it just opens this door that has been shut for so long.